It has been nearly a year since former President Trump officially declared the coronavirus pandemic a national emergency. The crisis closed shops and restaurants and put millions of Americans out of work. Social distancing and mask wearing are important safety measures put in place to help us get through the pandemic. But at the same time, some experts say those stay-at-home orders that paralyze the economy are helping boost radicalization, spurring sharp turns in political beliefs and creating waves of mistrust in our government and media. To help us better understand the mentality behind these behaviors, we're joined by Arie Kruglanski. He's a distinguished university professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Maryland. So explain, Professor, why pandemics specifically help to create more radical ways of thought. And what can you tell us about the types of people that generally fall prey to this phenomena? I note that back during the Spanish influenza crisis of 1918, 1919, that there were anti-maskers even back then.
Yes, well, what the pandemic does, it contains multiple stressors. The stress to health, the stress to relations with close others, the huge economic stresses that exist. And what all of these stressors do is reduce people's sense of significance and mattering. It disempowers people. It makes them feel fragile and weak. And under those conditions, they are very vulnerable to narratives that promise them the restoration of their significance. And many of the extremist narratives do just that. They identify an enemy that presumably is responsible in some way for their misfortune, for their suffering, and they identify a method, what needs to be done, in other words, to fight that enemy and to therefore become important and empowered once again. So the stressors that the pandemic introduces predispose people to believe in narratives that encourage belligerency and militancy and violence.
You know, Professor, Vlad and I have talked a lot about, what's different about what's happening right now. Is it, social media? Is it a lack of trust in some of our sort of authority figures? Is it that we are isolated from each other, which we were even before the pandemic? There's, all sorts of conversations about how people don't have the same number of friends as they used to have, and they don't live close to family members anymore. And then you point out, because you're an expert in this field, that, some things are just repeated over and over and over again. And when it comes to radicalization, there are three things that are always present, things that you call sort of pillars of radicalization. What are they?
These are what we call the three N's. The first N is the need. Human behavior is motivated. Nothing happens without some need being involved. And the need in this case is the need for significance. It's a very universal, fundamental need to matter, to have dignity, to have respect. The second N is the narrative. And the narrative is important because it identifies what needs to be done in order to regain one's significance, be it develop a pro-social career or be violent for a cause, become a hero, a martyr. And the third element that is also very essential is the network. We are social beings. We live in shared realities with others who we respect and whose approval and good opinion we seek. So the network, our network, validates the narrative, affirms that the narrative is correct, and it dispenses respect and dignity for following the dictates of the narrative.
So, but here's the question, Professor. I pointed out that during the influenza crisis of 1918, the pandemic back then, there were maskers. There was, in fact, an organization called the Anti-Mask League with very much the same narrative that is used today, that, you're infringing on my rights. And we know now, and we knew then, that wearing a mask would have protected people from dying from the influenza virus. I spoke to a woman who's 90 years old, and I asked her what she thought about the current state of where we are today in this country when it comes to vaccinations, when it comes to, specifically as it relates to the coronavirus. And she said to me something interesting. She said, in the 1950s, when the polio vaccine was finally being administered across the United States, we didn't question whether or not it was effective. Our scientists and our doctors told us it would save lives. It would save the lives of children. It would open up our lives where we could go and use swimming pools again and, drink water from the water fountain. There were all these things that had been restricted because of polio. And she finds it sort of interesting that we are back again where we are in 2021, where we were in 1918. But in the 50s, is it because there was a sense of optimism in this country? We had just won a world war and people felt good about the country, felt good about our leaders, felt good about science? Because I'm trying to understand, it must have something to do also with the periods and the times that we're living in.
You hit the nail right on the head. In the 1950s, there was a great trust in America, great trust in the government. That trust has eroded over time. This has not happened immediately. This has not happened in the last 4 years only. It's been a process that has been going on for decades. Now, the trust in public institutions is at its low point. We do not trust the presidency. We have not trusted the Congress for a while. We feel that the Supreme Court is polarized. We do not trust the Justice Department. We do not trust science and medicine anymore. We do not trust the church anymore. So who do we trust? We need to trust somebody because our lives are based on trust. We need to know what to do, and somebody has got to tell us what to do. And therefore, we are very open to all kinds of conspiracy theories. The conspiracy theories that there is a conspiracy against us, it's a deep state, or it's the immigrants, or it's the people of color, or whoever it might be, that they're responsible and they are limiting our freedom, and it's all a hoax. So these theories offer confidence, offer guidance. Of course, we know that they are incorrect. They are, totally divorced from reality. But psychologically, they fulfill the need for certainty that public institutions once fulfilled, and they no longer do so.
Now, Professor, as we watched the mob descend on the Capitol, I remember thinking, this is the worst that it could be, and the fever must break, that everyone will realize that it's gone entirely too far. And there seemed to be that feeling shortly after the attack on the Capitol. And now we hear, the bubbling up of the QAnon conspiracy theories again, that, in reality, March 4th is when President Trump will resume the presidency. And they've just kind of adapted and evolved to fit the need and the fears, to answer the fears of so many people. And so the question is, how do we break this cycle? What has to happen for the fever to break? How do you achieve de-radicalization?
Well, first of all, I think it's a very dangerous point in our history because you said, it's bubbling, it's probably as bad as it can get. No, it can get much worse. In Germany of the 1930s, the same movement or very similar movement that was, originally a minority movement that employed street violence, finally enter into government and engulf the entire country. So it can happen. We are not beyond the possibility of it happening here as well. What needs to happen, I think that the first thing that needs to happen is to cool down the temperature, cool down the rhetoric, because the rhetoric multiplies the difference between the dominant thing and other concerns. And once the temperature is lowered, it's possible to consider the whole panoply of issues that the country is facing. So I think that the President Biden is doing the right thing in having a lower profile, lowering the temperature, lowering the heat of the rhetoric. Secondly, I think that the pragmatic issues, these sentiments, the distrust, the feeling of being left behind, the feeling of lost significance are not imaginary. People actually lost their significance. There is research that shows that from 1972 to 2010, white Americans lost a lot of their standing, their their sense of social class has declined rapidly. So they feel that the reality has hurt them. And so one thing that needs to be done is to reduce inequalities, the economic inequalities that drive much of these sentiments, to overcome the pandemic, to deal with the pragmatics, and to lower the heat and introduce counter narratives that alert people to the dangers of extremism. All of these things need to happen at the level of the whole society, in the schools, in the community institutions, in the churches. We all need to be recruited and mobilized for that effort.
Professor, let me just ask you before we go, and you hit on something that I wanted to incorporate into my question, which is it fair for some analysts to equate what we saw in the 1930s in Germany with the rise of National Socialism and across, for example, Italy with the rise of fascism, to what we've seen in the Middle East with the rise of extremist groups waving flags, waving weapons, waving, propaganda banners. I just keep thinking to myself, if, those flags were replaced with ISIS flags, what would we be saying about what happened in the Capitol? So is it fair to take those historical antecedents that we've seen, for example, in Germany, that we've seen in the Middle East, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and say we're in danger here in the United States of seeing a similar movement taking foot in our government, in our places of where we live and breathe as Americans? And I wonder if the difference is, to the point that was made earlier, that our courts, with every challenge that the Trump administration placed on our elections, the courts rejected those challenges because they had no ground. That didn't happen in Germany. That didn't happen in some other countries that we're talking about. In fact, as the brown shirts gained more and more power, the courts and politicians fell to those violent extremists. But we haven't seen that yet here.
So it's a very important question. The historians tell you the one thing that you can learn from history is that you cannot learn from history. But joking aside, it's very, very dangerous to make a direct and exact historical analogies. At the same time, the human nature has not changed. Since the Homo sapiens appeared on this earth between 200 and 300 millions ago, our nature is the same. And we are prone and vulnerable to the same social psychological processes that we were not only in the 30s, but long before that. So I think that, the kind of processes that we see now, it's a different context, and America is a robust democracy, or has been so far. But the kind of trends that we see now and what is happening in the political arena can lead to a rise of a political party that would be not too different from the fascist parties of the 1930s. So far, we've been able to resist that, and I'm hopeful and pray that this will not happen. But because the human nature is the way it is, and it's prone to these phenomena, we must not be too confident, and we must be alert and vigilant in countering these phenomena, because they do have a power of developing, of insinuating themselves from a minority phenomenon, militant groups that are the fringe, to the mainstream, to the political mainstream of America, and that can be exceedingly dangerous.
Unlike science and facts, these conspiracy theories, they just sort of continue to grow and evolve to meet the audience where the audience is at, because nothing is pinning them to anything solid. Arie Kruglanski, Vlad and I could talk to you for like an hour,
really?
But I'm pretty sure we've already overrun our time. Very fascinating. Thank you so much, sir.
Thank you.